Kansas City, Missouri, April 12, 1877. The train stops in Kansas City after dinner and the 1st United States Special Operations Force departs, expecting to catch their train in the morning that will take them east along the Pennsylvania Railroad to Philadelphia. Kansas City is a sprawling railroad network hub, made all the more busy by the presence of the 5th Infantry Regiment under the command of Brigadier General Nelson A. Miles. These soldiers are returned from battle with the Indians and are now tasked with searching every train car, passenger, and piece of cargo that comes through the city. Only after the trains are completely cleared, can they be allowed to pass. The security is tight and not without good reason. Between the rail cars, the first sees a single unhallowed woman is being escorted by a dozen soldiers at rifle point to a dreary low-slung building. Her hair is long and straggly and her skin has a tainted pallor. She was once quite beautiful and still walks with the practiced grace of a debutante. In a nearby building a team of doctors and nurses are waiting to examine a long line of soldiers. The colonel and his team bypasses the queue of NCOs and after a short talk and exchange of credentials they are taken into a separate room and given a brief vitals inspection and visual examination. After they are all cleared, the colonel meets briefly with the adjutant under the local brigadier general and is given passes for himself and his men to travel near directly to Philadelphia on the next available train. They cancel their hotel accommodations and get right back on another train, still weary from the previous day's journey. The trains going east are laden down with soldiers and war supplies. The first receives a half-full boxcar of cargo which is securely strapped and chained down. They make do with just their bedrolls on the loud and bumpy journey. As they leave the station, an abrupt series of rifle shots can be heard and then silence. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, April 15, 1877. After stopping briefly in Lancaster Pa to pick up and drop off some men and animals, their train continues to Philadelphia. It has been 3 days and 1 night. The first is achy and sore from the trip, but they walk out into the bright sunlight, which illuminates Philadelphia, now a city in chaos. The city of brotherly love once had over 600,000 inhabitants, but now has taken on over that same number again as refugees from Washington, D.C. and the South. Horses run free in the streets and carts of hastily gathered supplies are toppled over and jam up the vital intersections. Civilians press onto trains and clog the roads headed north and west. There are fires burning unchecked and preachers stand at the thoroughfares castigating the masses as they pass. The 20th and 23rd Infantry Regiments are overseeing the civilian evacuation, but they obviously have their hands full. The 23rd is half-strength already and operating without a full command staff after their route from Washington, D.C. They have gone without proper resupply and have an obviously ragged and muddy look to them. Entire companies are sick with dysentery and being sent back to Kansas City, in a desperate bid to get them away from the front and back in fighting condition. A 26th and 27th Infantry Regiment is being called up and mustered in the city, though finding and properly outfitting trained soldiers and officers on such short notice is proving to be difficult as many such men have moved west. These units have a slipshod but tenacious look to them. They have mismatched firearms and between any 5 men you couldn't put together a single regulation uniform. The aging warship USS Powhatan has been once again recommissioned a 6th time for battle and brought up from the Bahamas. The old warship is anchored off of Fort Mifflin and is being hastily refitted with cannons and crew. A line of rowboats steadily comes to and from the great vessel as it undergoes this process. The forests across the Delaware River south of the city is clear of any signs of movements or malicious intent, but they have an eerie feeling to them. Every now and again, men and women will stand up tall and crane their necks to look in trepidation in that direction. On previous nights the scouts have reported seeing unhallowed moving in the forests, but these are believed to be the advanced elements of a much larger force. The dead are said to wear formal clothes, uniforms of the Union and Confederacy, and still possess items which they were buried with. There is rumor that the entire National Cemetery at Arlington has risen again and walks the earth by night. At the gate of Fort Mifflin the first Ussoff is challenged and then granted entry. The colonel is told by an aide-de-camp that he is expected to meet with the president at once. He and Captains Hess and Fairchild hurry to make themselves look presentable, while the rest are taken to the barracks for orientation and to settle in. For some this is not their first time in Philadelphia, but it would take a lifetime to learn all the history of the place. Fort Mifflin was used during the Civil War as a place where the Union kept Confederate prisoners, and 2nd Lieutenant Hunt is on edge from the minute he laid his eyes on the fortification. One of the redoubt's lodges has been cleared out and is being used as a makeshift setting for the U.S. War Council. A pair of hard-looking braves, of the Crow tribe, by the looks of them, stand guard at the doorway and stare at the trio of officers with suspicion and naked scorn. They slowly step to side, after one queer moment of awkwardness and inspection. Inside the building is a vast wide open room that was once a barracks or mess hall. It is now cluttered with desks, and trafficked with officers of every branch of the military. Cigar smoke hangs in the air and suspicious looks are on the faces of everyone, even those who were normally reserved, now seemed on edge and near panic. The fear was palpable and the voices held certain unsettling degrees of alarm, astonishment, and frustration. On the far side of the room, surrounded by a group of muscle-bound guards, was President Grant and General Sherman, speaking with Governor John Hartranft, Congressman Joseph Miller Campbell, the U.S. Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes and the U.S. Inspector General Randolph Marcy. The 6 of them seem to be the cooler-headed sort, but even they display puzzlement and genuine worry. They are standing around a beat-up map of the Philadelphia region that is a year out of date. Several corrections have been added in bold ink to represent the most recent additions to the ever-growing city's infrastructure. The colonel and his captains, though weary, approach and salute sharply. The president welcomes them with a tired smile and waves his cigar for them to join and introduces his associates. General Sherman and Captain Fairchild stare at each other intensely, before the general snarls in a low voice. "I was told these meetings would be for command officers and above." The president grins and seems to be amused by his friends and the captain's discomfort. He puffs his cigar, laughs and says, "Well, old Jack Gable, my boy, do I have a mission for you. Get your men ready because tonight you'll be out there, doing what the first does best." The President and General Sherman outline the situation. General Lee and his Army of the Unhallowed are on the march coming up from the southern shore of Philadelphia across the Delaware River, but they have curiously stopped along the way. The Union always knew that the Confederates secretly stockpiled supplies during the war, but most of those caches were already presumed to be found. Their army can now be expected to be equipped to some degree. Munitions and firearms do not always keep well when buried beneath the earth, but after DC they may well have armed themselves from the battle, as well as raided the federal arsenal there. This deviation has slowed their advance considerably, but the recent probing in Philadelphia is a sure sign of an impending attack. The scouts have had considerable problems in tracking them, as the sight of the vast host on the move at night is said to drive the fighting spirit from the heart of even the most grizzled veterans. The first will plant explosives on the bridges at Girard Abbé, Chestnut Street, and Market Street. The hope is to lure the enemy into a trap at these less defended points of entry into the city. This will leave the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge as the only way into Philadelphia from the south side of the rivers. The soldiers at Fort Mifflin will array themselves to prevent an amphibious assault. It is theorized that the Unhallowed may very well be able to walk beneath the water and need no naval support to cross wide and powerful rivers. However, it is likely that these submerged Unhallowed will be incapable of bringing their firearms along with them. The entire operation is meant to appear as though the U.S. military intends to make a stand in Philadelphia, although the reality is that the city is to be completely evacuated and abandoned. Time needs to be purchased to fortify the country against the Unhallowed. The military will likely need to be able to fall back a number of times. Philadelphia unfortunately will not be the last city to fall. The unnatural enemy almost completely defies conventional tactics. At night they are strongest, bullets have little effect and it is no easy thing to summon the courage necessary to confront them directly. The US military has had some success with using artillery and explosives against the unhallowed. 2 companies of the 1st Artillery Regiment are in position, one at Fort Mifflin and one at the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge. Another is hidden in reserve at nearby Germantown, which would be immediately turned on the city if the unhallowed choose to occupy it with the intention to stay. These heavy weapons are considered dispensable and would have to be destroyed and abandoned. The unhallowed under General Lee seem hesitant so far to charge an artillery position, but that nicety would surely not last. Having exchanged pleasantries with the President and his generals, the Colonel gathered the first, explained the plan and set out across the city to begin the work. The Colonel, the Captains Hess and Fairchild and the First Sergeant Carson must first head to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania right across the street from City Hall. They were told by Small Paul to meet a doctor there, but their time is limited. Much of the contents of the stately building have been taken away in the last week, but even still there are people milling about, who direct the group to meet with the doctor. The conversation is hurried, but essentially he details that the Freemasons, Knights Templar, and Scottish Rite were prepared for the unhallowed. These old organizations perhaps know more than they are letting on, but they have taken it upon themselves to combat this new evil that has been unleashed upon the world. The doctor bids them to survive Philadelphia and meet with him again in the near future to continue the discussion under better circumstances. Their mission would have to be discreet because the civilian population was already panicked. If word got out that the military planned to blow up the bridges, it might make a bad thing worse. There were still refugees to the south and Philadelphia was a vital railroad city and intersection of American commerce. Losing Philly is immeasurably damaging to the nation as a whole. The dangerous work of hauling and planting explosives would have to be carried out while these bridges were still in use by the civilians and the military. The first explained what they were doing was nothing more than checking these bridges for signs of sabotage or damage from the influx of traffic and that they had received orders to protect the bridges and oversee traffic. It took hours and the telling of some pretty bold-faced lies, and the water in the river was still incredibly cold. The explosives were all linked to several long fuses as the sun fell in the sky and the southern traffic all but stopped. The first closed the bridges with barricades and watched and listened like statues as the events of that evening began to unfold around them. By nightfall the majority of the Philadelphian population had left the place a ghost town. Those who could not leave hid themselves, but the military began to find these patriots, holdouts and die-hard looters with the help of some well-trained dogs. Gloucester, Camden, and Derby were also lifeless and completely quiet save for the smoldering of a few fires. The last rays of the sun died and the weather threatened to grow worse. A brisk cold wind brings memories of the winter that just passed. There is a sense of something terribly wrong and the animals begin to flee the southern forests in earnest. The silhouette and cacophony of 1,000 black crows covers the rapidly darkening gray sky. In the quiet there is the faintest sound of somebody playing a melody, but it too distant to tell if it is a flute or a violin or perhaps both. A long while passes and the streets of Philadelphia are intermittently lit by flashes of lightning and low rumbling thunder. No rain falls and soldiers defending the city at the fort and the railway bridge wait nervously for their enemy to appear. Some fire their rifles at shadows and the officers find themselves forced to demand calm and threaten to arrest cowards. The music grows louder and seems closer, but the wind is whipping around and making the tune seem distorted or perhaps it is being played wrong. Nevertheless it is oddly familiar and it seems to unnerve the dogs and horses. The men in the fort begin singing a hymnal but their efforts are suddenly halted at the sound of hail rockets slicing out of the forests on the southern shore and exploding at and around the USS Powhatan. A moment later dozens more of these rockets are fired at Fort Mifflin from the same location to indeterminable effect. The sounds of bugles call the soldiers inside to hunker down, however it seems that they were not prepared to come under artillery fire. The fort and the Powhatan are teeming with gunpowder and a direct hit would be disastrous. There is chaos in the lines and the officers are hard-pressed to restore order. Some forward-thinking crewmen of the 1st Artillery take it upon themselves to fire flares from their mortars onto the position of the rocket attack. Within seconds the Powhatan responds with its own smaller flares. The forest is bathed in thick smoke, but vague dark shapes can be seen toiling therein. The reddish light descends upon them almost perfectly illuminating the enemy position, which is covered in the bright white trails of 60 or more rockets. The broadside of the Powhatan erupts with the withering firepower of several Hotchkiss guns which are just barely within range. The outer edge of the forest is shredded and branches and trees collapse from the onslaught of several of these newly introduced rotary cannons. The fort also responds with a barrage from their heavy guns, but the darkness and smoke from the position masks the attack's effectiveness. With moments the forests once again erupts with the slicing roar of hail rockets. This time these weapons show their inherent weaknesses. Many explode on the ground, presumably killing the firing crew, and others are duds or travel off course into the Delaware River. More flares go up and it is now apparent that a large force of things are making their way towards the city, but much closer along the western shore and not to the south. The rocket attack from across the river to the south was meant as a diversion. There were thousands of them. In the red flare light they are a motley of differently dressed beings, priests, soldiers, debutantes, officers. They march, but it is a hard thing to watch. Some limp, others stagger, some are stiff and waddle, but they are not slow. As they near, their song becomes recognizable, and those veterans of the Civil War know "I wish I was in Dixie" now when they hear it played closer. Yet it is off somehow. The tune is right but the notes are wrong. All eyes are on them, and the artillery at the fort hastily tries to swing the weapons around to get rounds out in front of the marching force now to its north. The Powhatan is out of position and its sails have been lowered because of the rocketry. It lists in the river and tries to come around, but the wind and current take it farther away by the moment. The unhallowed army marches nearly unimpeded and reaches the first bridge, bypassing it completely. This bridge would offer the fortress the ability to pour down fire on the invaders. Captain Fairchild and First Sergeant Carson watch quietly in hiding with their horses as the army passes them over. Both are absolutely horrified at what they witness so closely, and they cower in silent terror watching the shambling abominations pass them by. The army marches so precisely that they make the most of the space in between the two artillery formations to regroup, before tirelessly heading onto the direction of the next bridge. This time they form up and orientate themselves to cross. There are still a line of straggling forces spread out behind them, some lost in the streets near Darby, others waiting for their entire formations to catch up. But they are in good cover from artillery, with the many historical buildings of western Philadelphia screening their approach. Both batteries erupt, but there is little evidence of any effectiveness. Here Captain Hess and Second Lieutenant Hunt wait for their one golden opportunity to catch the enemy on the bridge. The Schuylkill River is all but raging torrent here, and fat drops of rain have now begun to fall. The colonel stares at the massing unhallowed formation through his spy glasses from his position nearer to the train station. The third bridge would also likely be bypassed, because of its exposure to the artillery position at the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge. He, Major Jacobs and Small Paul were the last line of defense. Nurse Crawford awaited them at the train station, ready to tend to the wounded. The colonel wondered to himself if the army he was looking at was in fact General Lee's. Then he laid eyes on him, the old hated enemy and brilliant general of the Confederacy. Exact details were hard to make out, but it was surely him. The colonel remembered seeing him at Appomattox. He carried himself and sat his patchwork horse the exact same way. His distinct white hair glistened in the lightning flashes. The colonel stared and wondered. This force was not large enough to be Lee's main army. Instinct and hard-learned lessons from the war made Jack consider that the cunning general had once again split his forces. This force, though several thousand strong, was nothing but a diversion. His real blow would land in the west. He would attempt to cut the railroad and prevent the U.S. military's escape. He would attempt to trap them in the city and engage in house-to-house fighting, where his tough forces would be totally superior. The colonel sent Small Paul on their fastest horse to the artillery position in Germantown to spin them facing west and advance on the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge. All the soldiers at the fort and aboard the Powhatan were never really part of the battle at all. There were still hundreds of civilians, refugees, and wounded awaiting trains in nearby Frankfurt and Bryn Mawr. There would be no retreat ordered until the entire area was clear of at least non-combatants. The last of the big trains were arriving and then immediately leaving westward and northward in the next couple of hours. There would be fighting likely all throughout the night. After reconsolidating his forces for the next hour, General Lee spreads them out and aims to cross all three bridges simultaneously. Under the mask of the surprisingly good cover from the buildings of western Philadelphia, they separate into three forces and approach cautiously. To the south, the guns at Fort Mifflin are taking wild shots at them, and to the north the guns at the bridge are firing at targets they cannot plainly see. The attempt to cross happens nearly simultaneously on all three fronts. The roar of the U.S. military cannons carries on steadily for nearly 15 minutes straight, but with little practical effect. By this point western Philadelphia is burning, and despite the light rain, the fires spread and threaten to cause widespread ruin. The demolition of the bridges happens by chance within moments of each other, although it is obvious that the most calamitous destruction occurs in the middle. Perhaps several dozens or scores of unhallowed were caught in the actual blast. General Lee himself narrowly avoided being caught above several dozen sticks of TNT, however the fuses fizzled and sputtered out. After the explosions at the bridge to their north and south, the unhallowed made a path and urged their general to retreat. Seconds later that bridge exploded, catching some of the elite vanguard of the general in the blast. Captain Hess curses his luck. He narrowly missed the chance to decapitate the head of the dragon. After the bridges are no more, General Lee's army is forced to regroup again. The artillery fire, though seemingly random, is beginning to take its toll on the now exposed army. They withdraw into Darby and reform their ranks. The smoking fire of the demolished bridges hides their movement, and the artillery continues to pound a location which no longer contains enemies. General Lee's army now marches on the train station, though his fresh flanking force has already arrived there. The U.S. military scatters and abandons the rail yard in the face of the unexpected thousands of unhallowed and their patchwork cavalry. The bugle sounds the retreat. However, the infantry regiments are pressed up against the Schuylkill River and have few options. Things looked most bleak at this moment. However, the newly formed 26th and 27th Infantry Regiments mistook the call to retreat and charged the enemy, engaging them in exactly the street fight which the enemy preferred. Now the battle lines have fallen into complete chaos, and soldiers on both sides advanced blindly unsupported against one another. The fighting is absolute madness, as soldiers recognize the dead from the own regiment or close relation. The military holds its own in the intense hand-to-hand fighting in the pouring rain, though this may be attributed to the lack of an easily accessible escape route. The men here felt as though they were fighting for their very souls, and each privately dreaded the fate of becoming an unhallowed. Perhaps General Lee did not expect such a tenacious defense, but he was even more ill-prepared for the late and unannounced appearance of two companies from the 9th Cavalry and their daring raid from the west against his back lines. This further sowed discord in the general's ranks. They struck with their carbine rifles and bounded away again to the outskirts of Darby, obviously preparing for another attack. Though by this point some of Lee's forces had crossed the river successfully, it would be no easy affair bringing thousands across in a timely fashion. The train station was almost overrun. However, the hidden element in Germantown trained their guns well, after having crept into a position which left the invading flankers exposed. Small Paul had succeeded in bringing them about and into position to rain fire on the enemy. The nearly 1,700 soldiers left there at the train station trapped, rallied and retook their artillery position, and began firing into their fleeing opponents. If one was not aware, this part of the battle seemed to be well planned. The pure luck of their opening volley routed an entire mixed regiment of the unhallowed, leading them to fall back to Upper Darby. The name of Jeb Stuart began to be whispered among the U.S. soldiers in shocked awe and reverence, as some had claimed to have seen him amidst the charging unhallowed. Several hundred U.S. casualties lay dead, but they had little to show for it. Perhaps 50 unhallowed were slain, these mostly by the efforts of the artillery. The rest had presumably survived their wounds, even the obviously fatal or mortal ones. The U.S. military took this time to consolidate their own position. Soldiers at Fort Mifflin were beginning to be taken from the theater by boats upriver, where they would reform with other U.S. military elements. The soldiers at the rail station evacuated slowly and very deliberately, leaving sticks of dynamite in the guns as they left. Even the railway bridge was torched as the last of the military left the burning ruins of Philadelphia. The first was lucky to escape intact. Some of their number were wounded or exhausted during the fighting, however their nurse saw to the needs of their continuing health and well-being when they regrouped in Ohio. In the aftermath, Captain S and Second Lieutenant became separated but would eventually both come to rejoin the group. The next few weeks were spent at various hospitals along the way home to Graham. The first knew in their hearts that their contribution to the evacuation of Philadelphia was of vital importance, however it would never appear in the annals of history, for their unit did not officially exist. Though they had repelled the attack that would have perhaps left tens of thousands of civilians dead, Philadelphia was lost. The city was vital to the economy of America, and its loss goes toward splitting the northeastern states from the west. The opposing force was simply too powerful, and the dread which they inspire causes normal men to behave without honor and decency. Some soldiers who were at the Battle of Philadelphia would go on to excuse each other of cowardice and desertion, but it was widely known that these unhallowed had some type of unholy effect on their opponents. The captain of the USS Powhatan was found hung to death in his officers' quarters. His note indicated massive depression and spiritual hopelessness as the cause of his apathy towards living.